Hey, welcome. This is Chris Cline from the Agents Council for Technology at the National Big I, and trying something a little different here with a video and a little long form video. But we're really going to circle back to October, where at the Agents Council for Technology, we run an AgTech Summit, and one of our panels was called Demystifying APIs. Conversation we have all the time in our industry. It seems like a lot of uncertainty, which was the whole spirit of demystifying it. And going through the notes rather than writing an article, we thought it would be nice to get actually a live conversation going where we could explore the way that panel went. And what better way to actually do it than invite the person who really helped us design and physically moderated the panel, and that's Peter MacDonald. So Peter, yeah, thanks, man.
No, hey, it's good to connect again and, connect between now and then. Had a lot of fun. I think the event was packed. Hundreds of people. How many people were there, Chris? 200, 250?
It's right around 200, I think. We were impacted, if you recall, that was the hurricane and
that's right.
And a whole lot of different things with the weather. But first live and in-person event in nearly 3 years. We were, stoked to say the least. So
yeah, so I had put on LinkedIn, like, I'm bringing the heat. And I think APIs is one of those conversations that a lot of people want to have, and not necessarily a lot of people always understand. And so I think going into it for me, I really wanted to, I think the theme was, demystifying, and I'll share kind of some demystifying, like, how I kicked off the presentation, I guess. And I had this picture in the background. There's like a story behind that, and like how APIs are the promise of the future. And I think then the reality, of course, in our office is like, hey, could you announce our new APIs? And like, not everybody even knows what the APIs mean. And so I think, we had a great panel. We had leaders, and this is, kudos to the Agents Council for Technology and all the good you guys do in bringing together some of the, the most well-respected companies in the industry. We had Eric with Zywave, Doug from Vertifor, Elizabeth with Liberty Mutual, Shane from Applied. And I think, all agents out there probably know these names because these people have been in the industry for a few years. And so to kick things off, talked about, in reality, what are APIs? And we use this example of, how thermostats used to work versus how they work today. And how does that physical and digital, how does that pair up with APIs and how they've kind of changed interfaces that, we're all used to. And so, as you may recall, Chris, it was very important to me that we had collaboration. I think people come to these events for education. They come for entertainment. They want to be a part of the conversation, especially at the Agents Council for Technology. And so we launched a poll in the, live to the audience. I think we had about 82 responses. And so the first question, maybe we just dive into this, and I welcome your input as well. The first thing that I wanted to do was to just get a sense of like who's in the audience. How do you describe yourself? Are you Milton, the red stapler guy from The Office? Are you Jules, the tech boss from The Intern? Or are you Elliot from Mr. Robot, the hacker guy? And, I've done this poll a couple times now when I go to work, different presentations that I'll do. And this one was overwhelmingly like, hey, we identify as Jules, the tech boss, which was interesting. Oftentimes what I find, Chris, and I think, you and I were just chatting before we started the recording here, like I'll actually go and I'll be surprised, but a lot of people put themselves in the bucket, especially when you're talking to agents, of Milton, the red stapler guy. It's like, hey, like I'm sitting there and I'm clueless on APIs. And so this was definitely an interesting audience, from my opinion, where I'm like, hey, these people probably are pretty, technically sophisticated.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. I wanted to take just a second and call that out, right? Especially if you're, viewing this as an agent and going, holy cow, are really 2/3 of the agents that much more sophisticated? And I think that what Peter and I would both say, depending on the audience, it's probably far more likely to get at least a significantly higher percentage of folks that say Milton. And again, you're right. I think the audience here, it's an Agents Council for Technology. So even the agents and brokers in the room are those that are a little bit more tech savvy and tech forward, but there were also carriers and technology vendors in the room as well. So it definitely skewed the results. But the key takeaway is there's a lot of folks out here with still some uncertainty and opportunity to create clarity around what an API is and how it can help.
Right. So the next question was really, and this was, I think in lead up to the presentation, we had a couple of conversations with the panelists, and we just were kind of taking a ton of notes, getting thoughts and ideas out there. And a lot of my process was to structure that and to prepare it. And one of the takeaways that I think all of the panelists wanted to know is like, how do the people in the audience think that we on the panel should be building. And so it's like, how should insurers and software companies be building APIs? And I think this was actually one of Elizabeth's questions she had in the earliest forums. And so really it's, three kind of things. Number one is like, just make stuff work. I don't want to know how it works. Just make it work out of the box. Or maybe curate vendors for me, meaning, I want to have some flexibility to choose, but I want some guardrails. So I'm not going to make any, accidental or bad decisions. Or, hey, just make the API open so I can kind of do whatever I want. And then, provide documentation so that whether it's me or an organization I hire, they can interface with the API. I was pleasantly surprised, if I can say that, majority of people in the audience, wanted just an open API. I think if the audience has spoken, again, this is a little bit more technical leaning, but what they're saying is just make the API, make the documentation good. And like, I don't necessarily need to have anything curated. I don't need things to work out of the box.
This is another one too. And again, maybe it sounds like we're playing Mutt and Jeff on this thing, and that's really not necessarily the intent, but I think about this conversation a lot, and I'm an analogy junkie, but the one that comes to my mind here is, as a hot rod fan, is this notion around like everybody interacts with a car. Nearly everybody interacts with an automobile almost every single day. And you could ask the question similarly: how many people just want their car to work when they get in it in the morning with no problems asked? How many people like to tinker on the weekends, do some shade tree mechanic type stuff, and do some, versus how many people are like high-end hot rod builders? And, to me, the hot rod builder is the open API person, the curate kind of vendor approves, the tinkerer, and then sort of the make it work out of the box is the portion of the population that just wants their car to work. And so, I try to think about it that way to overly simplify it. And I wonder, again, if you had a room full of 100 middle of the bell curve, privately held independent agencies that want to remain viable, that want to have the tools and resources to be successful where they might go, probably skews a little bit more towards the blue, or the purple. I'm a little colorblind. But yeah, sort of a fascinating concept.
Yeah, it's an interesting analogy. I think one of the differences, in the industry, of course, is you have thousands and thousands of competitive players, right? You have nearly 40,000 independent insurance agencies. You have over 2,500 insurance carriers, and then you have different technology vendors. And so I think part of where the analogy might even break down is, what if you have, 10 different cars that you need to use to get to work every day?
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
Or like different toolings. And it's like, I think where the open API, where the realizations are coming from is, hey, everybody in this space does things a little bit differently.
Totally.
And if you're an agency that wants to have, an intake form on your website, or you want to have, better servicing of your customers, how are technology companies, how are insurance companies helping to enable that? Versus, hey, just build the flow for me. I can just speak, even from my experience at Wunderite, I was actually blown away. I think my product manager was telling me earlier this week, we have I would say about 20% of our customers have built integrations using Zapier. And maybe our customers are a little bit more tech leaning forward because they're trying new solutions, but maybe, I think as people are seeking to do things in a faster, better, more efficient way, they just want the tooling to be able to kind of do what they want with it. And what we found is like people actually build pretty cool things that we haven't built. We don't have the time to build. We think not enough people want it. I think the end users or consumers, they're willing to put the time in. How many times have you gotten feedback on a software or system, and people like they want something really bad, and you're like, hey, like we're not hearing that a lot, so like why should we build it? Well, they'd gladly put the time in if the tooling was out there. And I think that's where the open API comes in. There's a question later which we'll review where people talk about Zapier, which is one of these kind of like low code, no code ways of building technology. So anyway, interesting survey. To your point, I probably should run this poll again in kind of a more agent centric, less tech centric environment.
No, well, it's not even that, right? I think it's just all about context. And your point about there being 40,000 independent agents and 2,500 plus carriers. I mean, the exponential number of combinations there. And then you're right. Then you season that with however many different tech providers there are. I mean, I was asked to change majors somewhere in the middle of calculus 2 in college, so I ran out of horsepower. But exponential amount of combinations and complexity is not an exaggeration there. And so I think to the point there, the ability to kind of curate and customize and tailor, leveraging these capabilities is the real upside here.
Yeah, and I think it's one of the places where the Agents Council for Technology comes in, where you can bring together some of the leading companies that might have competitive overlap that can come together and figure out solutions, because to your point, it is kind of an exponential problem of the number of, networks and connections. The next question is just kind of getting a sense, what's your interest in APIs, trying to see if there's any themes. Overwhelmingly, people want to integrate their tools, which, maybe is obvious, but, we wanted to just kind of confirm. I think the next biggest thing is like a lot of people would want to learn more, even in this, technical forward-leaning audience. And then from there, I think, pretty robust interest in having simple API connections and also like instant pricing. So kind of interesting to just see the responses.
Yeah, I like that too. And software integration obviously is is a big bar here, big percentage, but it's also a nice catch-all as well. And when I think about this, one of the benefits is a lot of agencies are running probably far more disparate tools than they would need, or choosing ones they wouldn't choose in an ideal world, because they're sort of put in a position to choose tools because they integrate, not necessarily because they would provide the best value and align with their strategy and those types of things. So a lot of different information in that. And then even the instant pricing thing's kind of interesting too. And certainly don't have time in this video, but some of the agency universe study, which we're going to publish some results from here at ACT very soon, pretty low adoption of commercial line rating. It gets me thinking, is that an interest thing, or is it just not ready yet? Or is it because it doesn't integrate yet, right? There's a whole couple different swim lanes of whys behind some of the answers we can explore.
Yeah, I think from my experience, having been an agent, I just know it seemed like every year our carriers were asking us to do more and to use more systems, and things that used to be easy are now harder, right? Like you have to log in and now you need your two-factor authentication to log in. And then you need to, fill in the form, but then you get an error message. And it's like in the old days, you could just scribble on a piece of paper and you were done. And I think that compounded with, COVID has fundamentally changed the way people do business, where like now you can just, it's normal to do Calendly in a Zoom call. And so I think maybe where part of this is coming from as well is people are realizing, hey, I adopted a bunch of new tools in the past couple of years, and I think these tools should kind of should work together. And I think the pushback to the carriers, and you'll see it when we dive into some of the questions from the agents and the attendees, which is, there's been a lot that have been asked out of agents, a lot of different info from various customers. How can you make my life easier as an agent to just sell more business? I get paid to sell. How do I get those instant quotes? And I think, we've seen this, and, you've seen it to your point, maybe in some places low adoption, but on the flip side, I know there are companies out there like Openly that are very agent focused, and their adoption is really good. Like they're getting a lot of great feedback from agents. So
that's great.
Yeah. So moving on, I think these are some of the things we didn't get to touch on as far as just questions for the panel. And I kind of organize these in a few different categories. First generally is just like, how are you defining open API? Who's driving the discussion? I think Agents Council for Technology is one of the players there. What are the top use cases? What are the top priorities? How do we think about security? These are all really good questions. I think security, especially because if we're building systems with almost like a no-code environment, we're not always thinking when we're building stuff ourselves, hey, are we quality assurance testing this the way that software organizations do? If we build software, we need to test it a lot to make sure that we're absolutely minimizing bugs and vulnerabilities. And this is one of the things that came up on the panel was just in general was, security.
Yeah, I mean, that was, for context, that security thing was a whole other panel in of itself. And we had, comparable representation from large management system vendors and cyber gurus. But it popped up in some other aspects, even too, around culture and to your point around COVID and how are we dealing with hiring and remote work. And so it's a fascinating thing to think about. But I love the first one, right? So all these people said they're the robot, but yet one of the more sort of weighted, the tech boss. One of the more weighted questions we got from the audience was, and maybe it was sort of a lead the witness type of a thing, Peter, but let's define open API. Like, let's just what do we really mean there? And so, I mean, it might be worth too considering, who knows, who may be watching today, somebody who's building their business around these capabilities. Like, what is the 2-sentence version from Peter on Open API?
What is the 2-sentence on Open API?
You could do that, right? You'd be,
put me on the spot here. So, I mean, I think Open API in my mind is, APIs that are well documented and generally open to your customer set. So what that means is that you can generally do a lot of the functionality that you typically would have to be using a user interface provided by the vendor. Like you move your mouse, you click on a menu, you have to click to do an action. Those actions you can now do at the API layer, and there's not really, restraints. So that would kind of be my like quick definition of an open API. Does that resonate at all? Does that make sense, Chris?
Well, I mean, it does to me for sure. And just trying to help people understand if it's still something they're sorting out, that an API it's literally a program interface that allows different systems to talk to each other and transfer data in real time. So, thinking about it literally is the ability to plug any of your appliances into anything in the world and have it work. I don't know, I'm kind of really overly simplifying it there, but those capabilities.
Yeah, I was probably focused on like the open component. If we're talking APIs, sure. Certainly different. But so interesting questions nonetheless. I think the next kind of focus from the panel, and again, these are just individual questions. They weren't necessarily like, hey, 20 people asked this. These were like, fill in the box when you fill out the questionnaire. And this was a quick survey too. People are just pulling out their iPhones or whatever, or Androids, and answering a few quick questions. I was actually like, it was interesting how the questions fit nicely into some categories. And so the first one maybe was just carrier focus. And sometimes you can almost sense in the way that these questions are framed, like there's a little bit of pain or frustration right. That's coming from the person asking it, which, hey, look, I've been there and I get it. What's holding back carriers from supporting a single commercial rater? And I don't know, Chris, maybe you had context, but you had just said like the adoption was low based on this report that you guys are releasing soon.
Yeah, well, so the Big I does an agency universe study, and it just surveys all of its members more and more frequently, but now it's like on an every other year basis, and now breaking down personal and commercial lines and talking about the tools and resources. It does a lot of different stuff, but in the technology space, you start to look at, other than maybe the larger firms, relatively speaking, adoption of a commercial lines rater in kind of mid and smaller agencies is much less than large agencies and significantly less than personal lines rater adoption. And I think part of it, there are not a lot of them out there yet. I think a lot of it is too that there aren't really a ton of carriers out there yet. And so depending on your carrier mix, you may not even be able to get your suite of preferred markets available. And I think too, most would probably say this, we can say this in an objective way, carriers are still trying to figure out their question sets. And what do we really need? And so that there can be a standardized set of questions on these platforms, and allowing some AI and some RPA and APIs, all of those kind of buzzwords, to be able to kind of, can we get to the point where a question, even though it's worded differently than carriers B, C, and D, can satisfy their needs so that the agent can actually generate the efficiency gain, right? So that you still enter it once, if you have to go into 5 different carriers to do cleanup.
Right.
So those are some of the things that seem to be the hurdles.
And that exactly, that question is there. It's like every carrier wants to know different info. I think that, people are putting it out there. I think with Wunderite, that's part of, the way we approach the problem is like, we can't force 2,500 insurance carriers to agree on a common set of questions. How can we, as a technology company, kind of map that data back and forth? So I think there's probably a lot of reasons. Notably, like this question didn't necessarily mention like API. So, I think what's holding carriers back from supporting a single commercial rater, I don't know if it's an API or not. Maybe like, is there a unified API layer? But I don't necessarily think API is what's holding it back. I think more that this is probably a strategic question, to your point, where it's like insurance carriers still figuring that out.
That's a better way of putting it, right? And there's still some some tendency to view commercial lines as being a little bit more complex, and pricing has debits and credits, where in personal lines it sort of is what it is. And so the good news is, right, you see carriers and you see agents and you see technology enablers coming a decent, covered a lot of ground recently here. But if we go back to 2002 or 2003, carrier quoting platforms and personal lines comparative rating tools didn't work phenomenally in the first 18 to 24 months either. So we're doing a little bit of repeating history here with some revisionist sort of context about thinking it should be better, quicker, faster.
Right. I think interestingly that, kind of the two questions sandwiched here in the middle, when they say, where do we see carriers helping agencies with APIs? And I think what they're getting at, the two questions below that is, how do you allow agencies to take their service work that they do and then kind of pump that through back to the carrier? So, the second question or the third question is, many APIs are sales focused. How do we include servicing of customers? So whether you want to do, make a payment or, put a claim in, like, how do you make it easier for that stuff to flow back to the insurance carrier? I think it's an interesting question. I've been thinking about this for a long time as an agent, where if a customer calls me, I want to take an action in one spot and then just not have to think about it again. I don't want to necessarily have to log into the carrier portal with a different login, different, two-factor authentication code. I just want to work once and move on. So I guess you can probably sense I don't know if frustration is the right word, but the desire from the agents asking these questions, or whoever was in the audience. Yeah,
right. Yeah, you assume that was an agent piece of feedback, but you're right. That's it, right? I mean, I think the utopian view of this is, once a human being types something once, it never has to be typed again. And
exactly,
there's some real upside to that.
Yeah. I think there was some questions definitely for the agent focus, agent software focused angle, because there's a number of, organizations that build software for agents. Questions like, what's your top priority? How do these APIs impact the industry for the next 5 years? And then, of course, what's your plan for no code integrations like Zapier, which was definitely an interesting one where, you're seeing some companies pop up in the space, Insurance Gigs, Sonatic, to name a few, Enable, that kind of make it easier to grab data and work with data from an agency management system that has traditionally been a bit more challenging for the typical agency to work with. So I think there's some demand here where it's like, hey, we'd like to do more. Zapier is one that I think, works with over 4,000 to 5,000 different tools like Calendly and Google and Dropbox and Microsoft email. So it kind of makes sense that, you'd hear a question like that. Not necessarily sure the 5-year roadmap is something we can cover right now.
Not in 5 minutes.
Call.
But it is interesting, right? I'm going to use my cheesy, sort of car customizer analogy.
The hot rod example.
Yeah. I mean, as somebody,
next time we're going to have to do this at the, like the car museum or something.
Yeah, we should do that. But, like if you're somebody who wants to put aftermarket wheels to customize your car, I mean,
yep.
Pick the manufacturer. They all have a slightly different bolt pattern. Yeah. So I can't take this really cool set of wheels that I spent $4,000 on and put them on my Chevy and then be like, you know what, I'm going to now get whatever, a Dodge. Congratulations, you get the chance to buy, wheels and tires all over again, and hope you can sell them on Marketplace. But, that kind of stuff, that's just, I think what this speaks about is, how do we either figure out a way to let the stuff be transferable from platform to platform? Because we're probably not going to get Ford, Chevy, and Dodge to agree to make all their cars the same.
Not in this call, at least. The last one here was kind of the agent focused. I think, are you afraid that quote aggregators or insurtechs, use APIs to compete with the independent agent channel? My take on this is, independent agents aren't going anywhere unless, I guess, they refuse to make incremental improvements to their business every year. I think they're in their communities, they're active. Customers have overwhelmingly voted for them with their wallets and continue to. I think that some of the sharpest agents out there are probably using tools that are out there to, sell insurance on the internet rather than, having to come into the office. In fact, if you aren't doing that, like, you might want to wonder, why, but, they're using things like DocuSign, They're doing things like not having customers come into a physical office to pay bills anymore. Like, it only makes sense that, some of the sharpest agents that are out there are kind of building these tools. And so it's not necessarily just like, hey, we're competing against quote aggregators. It's just like, hey, we're competing against everybody we've been competing against before. It's not necessarily new. So I would say I'm not afraid of that. I think this is an opportunity for agents. I think it's an opportunity for agents who can build a better way of doing business, a faster, more efficient way. They're going to be nimble. They're going to be plugging into TikTok and Instagram, and doing things from a marketing perspective that are way more creative than these enormous corporations, can necessarily do or enable. It's just part of the beauty of the independent agent value chain. In addition to they're in their communities, they're involved in nonprofits, they pursue niches of business. Those quote aggregators are going to be out there, but I think, if you just think from a corollary, like when was the last time you bought a flight or a hotel or a rental car? What's your experience like, using an aggregator? In my personal experience, like, I kind of like to book it directly from the airline website or the hotel website, because I just feel better, about buying from them. Maybe that's an argument in favor of a direct carrier. But obviously different product. My point there is, like, I'm just not a big fan of aggregators. I think my trust is low. It's like, I feel like I'm giving my data and they're just going to sell my data all over the internet. And that's probably beyond the realm of the API part of the conversation. But I think these are questions that, they're good to ask. But I think the flip side is like, hey, what can agents be doing to provide a better value prop to their customer, using these tools that are out there, where it's like, look, we're not shopping your information to hundreds of different, companies, like selling the leads to the lowest bidder. We are taking your data, we're holding it, in our organization. And then we're going and working with like these 10 insurance companies that we work with. And we do, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars of business a year with.
Yeah, those are great examples. And it's great insight, right? And there's so many different ways, and interest of time, I could pick 4 or 5 swim lanes to take from that. But you're right, the independent agency is winning, right? And again, market share data, some of the studies the Big I does and some other firms do. We talked about 40,000 independent agencies. That's up from about 36,000 just 2 or 3 years ago. And market share in both personal lines and commercial lines has increased. So there's more agencies and the market share went up. Now, again, one large sort of a captive writer sort of went independent, but that kind of had already played out largely in the numbers. And so it's a great environment to start an agency, get some capital. There's a lot of tools and do different things. I think a lot of the M&A activity has now gotten to the point where sellers and producers are kind of working through their any earnouts or non-competes, and they're going to go start their own deals or buy other small agencies. So a lot of cool things happening there. And there's just a flight to quality when the world gets funky, right? There's just human beings want to feel taken care of, I think, to your point. And so in a world where we went through a global pandemic, and I think we've outrun the early phase of insurtech, where there was a lot of external capital that wanted to disintermediate all of us. Now all that is here to help. So, but despite all of the stuff that's going on in the world, the independent agency channel got larger and made a deeper penetration into that. So there are always going to be people that will buy online. They'll buy at 11 p.m. You got a contractor that got fired on a Friday and starts a snow removal business over the weekend. Most agencies, when you stop and think about it, that's not their target customer anyways. And if it is, build a model using all these online tools and go fight with these.
Exactly. I was going to add, I mean, I know personally, we've done work together with agencies that make it easy to buy insurance online. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think like the same tools that are out there for aggregators, in some way, this might level the playing field. Again, I think notably, there's a question earlier where the person didn't even mention API. It was just like, what are carriers? What was the question? It was, what's holding carriers back from supporting a single commercial rater? It's not APIs. And in this case, are you afraid that aggregators, use API to compete with it? Like the API part's actually not even necessarily super relevant to the question. Like aggregators and insurtechs have always been out there and competing with the independent agent channel. So it's not necessarily API that we want to have as like the scapegoat here that's enabling that.
That's a good point, right? It's not the silver bullet, and it's also not, it's also not the goat
This conversation's been here for 40 plus years, right? And I think to your point, like you guys have the survey, you guys have the data, independent agents are winning in this market. I think, question here is like, and this is kind of funny, like when do we not have to be Mr. Robot to implement APIs? Like when do we not have to be some crazy hacker guy? And I think, we're getting there. I think you can go on and watch a YouTube video in a couple of minutes and see how Zapier allows you to connect multiple applications. We have, again, 20% of Wunderite customers are doing this today. And I would imagine that, 20% of our customers are not Mr. Robot. So just anecdotally, in my experience, agents have always been sharp. We have some really bright customers. And I think what they've had as a challenge is in the past, they had to write software or they had to hire an engineering company. Yeah. Today, you don't have to do that. You just have to go on YouTube and know what you want to do. And you can kind of point and click and figure it out. And so I think we're getting to that point. And it actually leads in nicely to the last question here, which is just like, how do we encourage our vendors to make that thing more easier, to have open APIs? And I don't know, I think that's quite, Chris, a question for you. I think, with the Agent Council for Technology is like, what can agencies do to encourage their vendors to, give them the tools that, at least in this survey, overwhelmingly people want?
Yeah, we just encourage having the conversation and having it directly with people. With that, you could show them what the day in the life of looks like. And so it's really easy to scream from the rooftops on social media that something's broken. I presume most of the people are also having conversations, but get involved, try to collaborate. I mean, whatever you want to call it. I mean, I think the more people truly understand the point of view of all the other folks, and there's probably more to this than thing, but you think about the three legs of the stool: carriers, agent brokers, and technology providers. I mean, it takes all three to make this industry work. Industry's still pretty healthy. I mean, this raises some eyebrows when I say this, but the market share data, or the best practices data, Big I partners with Reagan, so this is independent data. Agency values are an all-time high and margins continue to rise. So I know there's a lot of noise into that, right? A lot of work's getting pushed around and it's hard and it's expensive to buy all that kind of stuff. But I think the takeaway is, you're not going to go out of business tomorrow unless you refuse to change. So the industry is really healthy. I was at InsurTech Connect in, I guess last year was 2021. I was on a panel and the question was, is this an existential threat for the independent agency channel? And we unanimously agreed, not the channel, but it is for an individual agency that puts their head in the sand. So come along for the ride, have conversations, have meaningful strategic conversations, whether it's your EMS provider or the other tools you use with your carriers. Let them know what you're thinking, how you want to invest. All of that kind of stuff sounds really Pollyanna, Peter, but it works. I mean, you were at that event, all those folks up there on stage probably take shrapnel day to day, but they all flew on their own dime to Nashville to sit on stage as competitors and to have a healthy, robust dialogue about how we can make the industry better. I mean, that's pretty powerful stuff.
Absolutely. I would add, I think, like, vote with your wallet. I mean, buy the tools that provide open API, start building things and using them and getting value out of them. I think, there are agencies that are out there that make it easy to, buy XYZ because they've connected things and they have flows. And the more that you're doing that to drive efficiencies, the more you're going to your, industry events and talking about it. If people at these organizations are going to notice. I think if you're an insurance carrier whose job is to make it easier for agents to sell insurance, and you realize all of a sudden that you're losing deals because you've made it harder to do business together. Like, I think, voting with the wallet, it's going to work and making your voice heard. And maybe there's room for a follow-up conversation on APIs at the next Agents Council for Technology. We can kind of, continue to dive in more. I think yeah. And I think that one of the realities too, is I think, talking to Elizabeth with Liberty Mutual, is these tools are out there. It's one thing to say, build an open API, but an API is in of itself, it is a product. And the data is that, people will be asking for that product and then they don't know what to do with it. Yeah. And so it's like, make those use cases real and, make your voice heard, I guess, be the loudest voice in the room.
And yeah, and maybe in wrapping here, you made a comment. We've been having these conversations for 40 years. And I started pretty early in my career as a field rep, personal line sales manager for a carrier. and even predating that, I mean, make my life easier, help me write more business, help me service my business, whatever. Back then it might have been, you know, quicker turnaround time, answer your phone call, make your underwriting manuals and your appetite guides cleaner to you. I mean, all of those kinds of things still persist, right? It's still about, I think ease of doing business was actually a trademarked expression by a carrier, but it is all about how easy it is to do business together, and see it all the time. I mean, business ebbs and flows between carriers and agencies, and even with technology providers, based on an ease. And that can mean a lot of that can mean price, that can mean appetite, that can mean service. So it's just a lot of different things. And so just taking all of those things and realizing this isn't really a new conversation. The words change and the tools we're talking about change, but this is just part of doing an independent distributor model.
100%. Hey, I'm with that last person, whoever asked that question. How do you encourage your vendors to move to open APIs? You know, we're doing that at Wunderite, where most of the stuff you want to do in Wunderite is accessible via API. And I think, like, what else can you do? I think go to the next Agents Council for Technology and, you know, be part of the conversation that's going to move the industry forward. I think, you know, if you were there, you'd have a chance to talk to everybody who's on stage that day. And not just the panel we did on APIs, but there is, you know, a tremendous amount of great guests, people that are there to move the industry forward. To Chris's point, you know, flew there on their own dime. Chris, to your point. I think, you know, go there and be a part. When is the next Agents Council for Technology?
Stay tuned. And actually, you know, this will probably come out afterwards, but on January 20th, we're doing sort of a thought experiment, smaller insurtech panel at the Big I Winter Meetings in Savannah. And so a little bit of a thought experiment around whether there's room for smaller, more frequent type sessions, or the big all day thing like we did. So talking to some strategic partners about when, where, and how we bring folks back together again with ACT in calendar year 2023. So I love being in person. I love industry events. I learn 100 times more than I could ever share. So we definitely want to do it again, but appreciate it. But definitely appreciate you. Again, flying on your own dime, we talked about that, but by that, I mean, I know trying to build a company and run a company, and then also figure out a way to facilitate a panel for an event that's really not yours, meant a lot. It was a great session, great tools, highly interactive, and then to kind of bring it to life again here a few months later in something hopefully way more valuable than an article was awesome. Thank you, Peter.
No, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for having me. And everyone else, best wishes for 2023.